There's very minimal distance between my persona on the page and who I really am. And then when I'm writing poetry, that persona really takes on more weight.
The Book Review's poetry columnist, Elisa Gabbert, is here to talk about how she approaches criticism and her own newest collection of poems, Normal Distance.
He's talking about an image that he takes from Proust, and it's in that section when he has this epiphany about what it takes to be a good person.
Ian Johnson joins me to talk about the life of Wang Shiboa and his novel about China's Cultural Revolution, The Golden Age. Plus, I talked to my colleagues Dave Kim and Elizabeth Egan about what we've all been reading. This is the Book Review Podcast. It's August 5th. I'm John Williams. Elisa Gabbert is here. She is the Book Review's On Poetry columnist. She is also the author of two delightful and thought-provoking books of prose, The Word Pretty and The Unreality of Memory. And she is just about to publish in September her fourth collection of poetry, Normal Distance. Elisa, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start with your life as a columnist. You work on the poetry column for The Times with the esteemed Greg Coles, our poetry editor here. How do you go about figuring out which books you want to write about and your way into things? Because you definitely write essayistic pieces. These aren't just straight reviews of books of poems.
I tend to flip through a lot, and I'm looking for books that I feel like I have something to say about. And so it's kind of paying attention to my own mind whenever I'm reading poetry. And I figure there are a lot of readers of the Book Review who don't regularly read poetry. I encounter people who don't regularly read poetry all the time. And so I'm kind of trying to lead them in and draw them in and show them how I read poetry and make it seem like something that might add some value to their lives. So I'm looking for things that I actually have something interesting to say about. And that's not always, the most popular books or the books that are getting the most coverage elsewhere.
And in that process, it seems like you're also looking for connections, because many times in your essays, you're writing about things like, for instance, in your most recent, the headline is Chance, Design, and Inevitability in 3 new poetry books. And so there are structural things you're looking for and comparisons and contrasts you can make between the books. And I assume that's part of the fun.
It is, yeah. I find that whenever you're reading multiple books, you inevitably find connections between them. So for this month's column, I was trying to kind of almost put books at random together. And then I ended up, of course, writing about randomness. But that's because for my last column, I took on such a big question. I was writing about what poetry is. And that's one of those that's one of those life questions that I can honestly say I've been thinking about for, 30 years.
Did you pitch that idea to Greg, or did you come up with it together? That was sort of the anchor of a big poetry issue we had, and it is quite a daunting question.
Yes. Yeah. We kind of came to it together. He was wondering if I'd noticed any big trends in recent poetry. And I couldn't really think of anything that I wanted to write an essay about. And so he suggested, what is poetry to you? What does poetry mean? And I've always loved collecting definitions of poetry. So I said yes right away. And then as I got started, I quickly became intimidated by by just such a towering question. And I was like, oh my God, people are going to get so mad at me no matter what I say.
Did you get angry letters?
Well, it depends how you define angry.
Firmly worded.
I mean, there was one letter to the editor from Marjorie Perloff, who I think I gently disagreed with in my column. And she gently disagreed with me, which is, fair game.
Gentle disagreement is all fair in love and war and poetry. Where are the far reaches of poetry for you? Are there things that you would think of or define as poetry that other people might wonder what you're thinking?
I think a lot about what prose poetry is, because that's sort of one of those cases where people can argue. And just before we started recording, you asked me if my new book is my fourth book of poetry. And I said it depends how you count, because I did write a book of pure prose poetry, which you could also call, micro essays or micro prose or something like that. I tend to think that, the more white space, the more it's like poetry. So a prose block can feel like poetry if it's pretty short. But the longer the prose block gets, the harder it is to call it poetry. And I also think, single prose lines, there's a lot of single prose lines in my new poetry collection, create more white space. So even though it's sort of technically prose and they're almost more sentences than lines, you're creating all those breaks and all that white space and the kind of like lyrical gaps that let the reader in more. And that is another thing that makes it feel more like poetry and less like prose.
So as a practitioner, since I think you consider the third/fourth book that you're describing as prose poetry, if they're micro essays, what is it in your mind as either you're writing them or when you're reading them afterwards and sort of considering them, that is it some kind of lyrical impulse you have while you're writing it? Is it something else that you could specifically even name, or is it just a feeling?
For me, it's really that when I'm writing what I would call a nonfiction or an essay or just pure prose, I'm really trying to be accurate. I'm allowing, like, I could be fact checked. I'm not lying. I'm really telling you what I think. There's very minimal distance between my persona on the page and who I really am. And then when I'm writing poetry, that persona really takes on more weight. I'm definitely creating more distance, and it really feels more like fiction, or even more like theater, I might say. I'm really more creating a character that's going to be speaking this monologue that I'm writing. And I don't think it has the same kind of truth value. You definitely could not fact check it. And it's not that it's not me, but it's definitely like a version, a highly stylized version of me on the page when I'm writing poetry.
That is a really interesting, more metaphysical answer than I was expecting. And I could follow it down some other tangents, but I won't, because I want to talk about a few other things while I have you. You do seem to be someone who likes to write, that the idea of the poetry column and writing about the nuts and bolts of the craft, and also both as a practitioner and as a reader. I don't think everyone who writes or creates anything, not everyone has that joy or impulse it doesn't come easily to them necessarily to do that. I mean, have you always been someone who felt like that was part and parcel with your creative impulse, was to analyze it and write essayistically about it as well? It always felt comfortable?
Yeah, it has always felt comfortable to me. I love reading and writing. Those are kind of the great experiences of my life. I feel like, I go to books the way some people travel. It's just when I'm happiest. And so then writing about writing or writing about reading, I'm even more happy. It's like double joy. It's like brewing coffee with coffee. I'm almost never having more fun than when I'm like writing about writing or writing about reading. And I think what I bring to the column that another writer or critic might not is just a real love of close reading. Like, I don't think I'm the most well-read or the most scholarly critic out there. And when I read other poetry critics, I often feel like they're doing more in terms of breadth and, placing people in a tradition. And I think that's really exciting to read. But I just love a good close read. I really love to pay attention to those little kind of micro decisions that poets make around, say, punctuation. And one of my favorite columns that I wrote was about punctuation in poetry.
Well, speaking of close reading, I should mention briefly before we get to your latest book of poems that you wrote a piece, a very visually and writing-oriented piece for the Times about Auden's great poem, Musée des Beaux-Arts, which was a close reading sort of alongside images of paintings that are mentioned in the poem. And it got, from my perspective, I just saw an incredible amount of enthusiasm and love for that piece online. What was that like afterwards? Who did you hear from, and how did it feel? I know that we put you through the ringer to produce that piece, and so you earned a Purple Heart, I think, of criticism going through that. But how did it feel in the end?
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, that was such a challenge to write. It's just so different from just writing an essay. I had to think about it in a totally different way than a typical essay. But it was so fun. It was such a fun challenge. And even though it was really difficult and we had to go through so many rounds of edits, I really loved that process, like I love working with editors who care about those same tiny things that I care about. And we really did kind of argue over every comma and em dash and is this word going to be in italics or not? And, should the reader have to scroll one more move to get this next sentence? I thought all of that was just so fun to think through. But we were so close to it for so long that by the time it went up, I was like so sick of it, and it was all so familiar that it seemed really kind of boring and obvious to me. I was like, I'm not saying anything new about this poem or this painting. So it was actually just such an overwhelming experience to find that people really loved it. And I heard from people all over the world for weeks, really, after it went up about it. And people saying, like, oh, it felt like just a great college lecture. It took me right back to being in college. And I thought that was so fun because I remember those great lectures too. And I'm not a professor. So it was really fun to be able to give people that experience, but on the page.
It was great for us to hear that too, because that's part of the goal, is to recreate that feeling of those great lectures that you most remember. Not the ones you dozed off during, but the ones that really, even 10, 20, 30 years later, you kind of recall. And I should just mention in passing, because it was such a group effort. And so our graphics team, Alicia DeSantis and Nick D'Onofrio, were just as close or even closer than us to the creation of it, at least as it's experienced by users. It's incredible. So I definitely wanted to mention that. So onto your new book, Normal Distance, which is coming out in September. When you publish a book of poems, I'm always curious about this, and I don't know enough poets to have many answers, but when you finish a book of poems, is it, this is the last year or two of productivity for me? Or how much curation goes into it in terms of feeling like the book has a coherent identity? And if that's a big part of it, then what does this new book feel like to you?
That is a big part of it ever since, I think your first book, everybody always says this, is kind of like everything you've been working on your entire life up until then, in a way. You're culling stuff out and putting more stuff in, but it covers more material. And after my first book came out, I found that I had to kind of teach myself how to write poems again in a way that felt like, oh, I'm contributing towards a larger project. This isn't just a one-off thing. This is going to be a book. And so my second book, I tried writing prose poems. After that, I ended up writing almost a dramatic monologue of poems in the voice of a character from a play that I had been reading a lot. And for this book, it's basically everything I've been working on since that third book came out. But again, I had to sort of invent a new form. And so the form was these sort of long prose lines, but with white space in between. And part of that came from wanting to have something to perform when I was touring around with my last book. I wanted some new poems to read, so it wasn't just the old stuff that, again, was kind of overly familiar. And I started by curating my own tweets into performance pieces. I would search my Twitter archives for a word like, love or hate, and string together all of my tweets from 10 years of tweeting on a certain topic, or like with a certain bit of language that was repeating. It wouldn't even necessarily be a concept. It might be a string of words like a kind of, a kind of, a kind of. And so I would find little bits of patterned language like that and build a poem around them. But as many tweets as I have, which is an embarrassing amount, I think it might be, in six figures. I did kind of exhaust that material and start just writing poems in that same format and following that same pattern, but without using my tweets as starting points quite so much anymore.
Okay, so you've described it very well, but let's see an example in real time. And speaking of performance, why don't you read a poem from the forthcoming collection?
Absolutely. So this poem is called That to Philosophize is to Learn to Die. And it was one of the first, if not the first, poems that I wrote and started to feel like, oh, maybe I could make a book out of this. That to philosophize is to learn to die. There was a metal band that was just called Death. I used to think I wasn't afraid of death, but actually what I wasn't afraid of was being dead. You can't attend your own funeral, but you have to attend your own death. You are going to die of something. I hope I die of boredom in my sleep. Do you ever remember being so excited about the future you were afraid you might die before it happened? I mean, who cares, of course, democracy is dead. Death wish, free will, cause and effect, happiness as misery. I wonder if the wealthy dinosaurs were the last to die. Hemingway titled a book Death in the Afternoon, which is the best possible name for a cocktail, then invented a cocktail named after it. I am extremely jealous of this whole move. I don't actually want to die laughing. Only one image of Virginia Eliza Clem Poe has been authenticated, a watercolor portrait painted several hours after her death. There was 100% a culture of dead bodies are cool. Is a beautiful woman still beautiful even if all men everywhere are dead? Vanity ends with death. Who wants to be present in the moment? I want to die when an asteroid hits my cryogenic chamber. Naps, but for death. You can't actually sleep when you're dead. The secret to immortality is boredom. If you're bored enough, you'll never die. Die with dignity, like Benjamin Guggenheim. Death by attrition, war of natural causes. Death has an anchoring, as in dragging down, effect, so don't die. Sex and death kind of rhyme. You can sleep in your deathbed. Sappho, to die is evil, the gods think so, else they would die. Cry now, die later. Move to Europe, smoke and die cool. I want to die someday. I don't want to die laughing.
Well, speaking of laughing, I'm glad I muted my microphone while you read that because I definitely laughed loudly a few times. Yeah. And then also grimly pondered things a few times. So thanks for the roller coaster ride. I appreciate that. Elisa Gabbert, I think that gets your voice quite well. So thanks for choosing that one. The new forthcoming poetry collection, again, is Normal Distance. And I also urge everyone who has not read all of your On Poetry columns in the Times to go to the website and look them up because they are a delightful door into poetry, as you describe them, but they're also just full of insights and aphorisms and things that will keep people pondering. Thanks so much for taking the time to be here, Elisa.
Thank you so much for having me.
Ian Johnson joins me now. He is the author of several books and also an expert on China, where he lived for 20 years and won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the country. His recent piece in the book review is in our Roving Eyes series, which focuses on international literature. And he writes about the novel The Golden Age by Wang Xiaobo. Ian, thanks for being here to talk about it.
My pleasure.
I asked you on because this is a really fascinating essay/review you wrote of this book. Take us back to when it was first written, which was, I think, the early 1990s, and where Wang sort of fit in the literary landscape at that point.
Yeah, well, the book was published in 1992 in China, but he began writing it in the 1980s, and he had a sort of writer's block. He'd published a very minor novel that went nowhere in 82, and he was working on this piece, which was about his experiences as a youth in the Cultural Revolution. And he couldn't figure out exactly what to do with it or whether it was any good. And in the 1980s, he had gone with his wife, who was a very prominent sociologist named Li Yin-he. They'd gone to the University of Pittsburgh, where she was going to do her PhD in sociology. And he sort of tagged along as a trailing spouse and took courses in Asian studies with a prominent Taiwanese American scholar, Professor Zhu. And so in 1991, he mailed him a draft of this. And Professor Zhu thought it was amazing, sent it to a Taiwan newspaper, which sponsors and still sponsors a very prominent prize, Sinophone Literature Prize. And it won in 1992. And it was sort of a sensation because Wang Xiaobo was not part of the Literature Writers Guild. The prominent writers that we know of today, like the Nobel Prize winner Mo Yan, they're all part of the Writers Association. They come up in our version, maybe through MFA programs or something like this, whereas this guy had a sort of checkered background, bumped around from job to job, and all of a sudden he came out on the landscape with this novel. That followed an avalanche of work that he published.
Up to that point, was Wang a kind of proud outsider, or was he really hopeful to break into those more mainstream ranks with those other writers you mentioned?
I don't think he was wanting to stay outside of it because he was trying to make a political point or something like that. I think like many people who grew up in his generation, he was born in 1952. He experienced the Cultural Revolution, and that wrecked his academic career so that he didn't really have much high school. He went to college and studied business, and he worked in the chemistry department at a university later and at the economics department of a university. But he knew he wanted to be a writer. He just wasn't going through the more conventional route of working for the Writers Association and, publishing short stories and novellas and stuff like that. He just was writing on the side, essentially.
Was the novel, when it appeared in the 90s, I assume it was controversial?
It was controversial primarily because of the sex. There's a lot of sex in the novel. The hero and heroine are constantly having sex. The sex is not really described in graphic detail. This isn't Henry Miller or something like that. It's more like they're having sex to sort of make a point that that they're independent people and they're not going to be trampled by the state. And it's very humorous. He talks about sex using all kinds of euphemisms like great friendship, to commit great friendship and stuff like that. And it's meant to be a sort of parody, a somewhat absurd version of a romance in a way.
This will probably get at some of the parody. This is a sentence in your review that's a little hard to forget. You write, outed for having a premarital affair, which was taboo in the Mao era, they are forced to write erotic, quote unquote, confessions for horny Communist Party officials and ascend stages to describe their acts to crowds of bug eyed farmers. So is this a punishment meant to humiliate them?
I think it's meant to be a parody, sort of a dark parody in a way, of these self-criticisms, because people were accused of doing sometimes really crazy things, like their father had been a traffic policeman for the KMT before 1949, and this made them a bad person and an outcast. And so they'd have to write confessions about how terrible their father was. He'd traffic policeman. It was terrible. And he'd transferred to them. It would go on and on. It wasn't just enough to write one confession. You were constantly writing and rewriting your confessions. And once you were identified as a problematic person, and there were millions of these problematic people, the so-called black elements, you were trotted out at every campaign and had to write more confessions and go up on stage and confess and be beaten and hit and stuff like that. So I think he's trying to parody that as much as anything else.
Let's zoom out a bit to talk about the protagonist of this book. He seems to be somewhat autobiographically created to match Wang's life. When the book opens, he's 21. He's an ox herder in an obviously rural area. What is his situation, and how does the trajectory of his life match the author's?
Yeah, like the author, the hero, whose name is Wang R, and R means two, which means he's probably like the second child, and that was also Wang Xiaobo was the second child in his family. So Wang R is a sheep herder or cattle herder in southern Yunnan province, which borders Thailand and Burma. And he has been sent there, like many young people in the Cultural Revolution, just like Wang Xiaobo had been sent there in 1968. He spent 2 years in Yunnan, and this was meant to be, you were supposed to go to the countryside and learn from the farmers and be toughened because you were the first generation born in the communist era. You hadn't suffered previously, so now you're going to have to be toughened up and understand the rural revolution. But what happened to a lot of these kids is they went down to the countryside as teenagers. They were completely useless to the farmers. They were just more mouths to feed. They were abused by the local cadres. Sometimes women were often raped. It was a pretty horrific situation for many people. And then they did everything they could to get back to the cities and at some point start up their education again. And that's sort of the big picture of Wang Er and Wang Xiaobo.
When they were young, I say they, maybe it's not both of them, but you mentioned that when they were young, being good meant imitating Mao and being zealous communists, and that their idealism soured over time, or they became disillusioned or awakened, however you'd want to put it. Does that describe both their arcs in terms of, was Wang as a young person pretty unquestioning and devoted to the cause, and then when he became older, he fell out with it?
So when the Cultural Revolution started in 1966, he would have been 14 years old. And when he was sent down to the countryside, he was 16 years old. So 2 years later, I think like a lot of these people, and he describes this in the novel, they grew up feeling they had to do something heroic, that the generation before them had done this heroic revolution. They'd gone on the long march where they'd trekked thousands of miles through the backwoods to survive. They'd fought the Japanese, they'd fought the nationalists, they'd created this communist state, utopia, and that they had to do something equal. And so just like their fathers or their imagined fathers and mothers, say up in the party Mao, like they had fought with the KMT, they had to find people to fight and struggle with. So hence they dragged out these poor people who had somehow been identified with the previous regime to humiliate and attack, or anybody in a way with an education or who liked art or literature was then considered suspect. It was a bit like Pol Pot, but it just didn't end up with the mass genocide in Cambodia, but it was a similar attack on anybody with education or sophistication or overseas ties or anything like that. And so this is, after a while, then they realized this is really terrible. Anybody sort of with a conscience began to wonder, well, why are we doing this? And I think a lot of people then really soured on the revolution at that point.
We've been talking about Wang as a teenager, among other stages. We should mention that very sadly, he died in 1997 when he was just 44 years old of a heart attack. You knew him personally. How well and how often did you meet him? And what was that relationship like?
Yeah, I met him in 1996. I was a correspondent for the Baltimore Sun, and he had been publishing a lot of essays in various newspapers and magazines around China. This is a time that was relatively more open than today, when there were not really independent media, but media that were a little more commercially oriented and willing to run racy articles. And he wasn't writing about sex or anything like that. He was criticizing nationalism in China. He was criticizing a book that had just come out around that time called China Can Say No, no to the West, no to America. And he thought these people were basically morons. And he wrote essays about that and talked about how we needed more integration with the outside world and not less. And we shouldn't be closing ourselves off again. And he was quite outspoken. And I interviewed him and met him again in that context. But I can't say I really knew him all that well. But we went to lunch and went back to his home, and I met his wife, who I got to know better actually over time when I went back to China, because as you said, he died just the next year, in fact.
You mentioned in the review that only one section of the book had been published in English until this new translation came out of the full book. Who was it translated by, and why did it take so long? I assume that people who have been interested in Chinese literature as English readers or academics would be very interested in this.
It was translated about 10 years ago and published by State University of New York Press as Wang in Love and Bondage, which was a bit of a strange title. And it has this cartoonish cover with a guy being with a woman and I don't know, looked like some S&M scene or something like that. And it was a good translation of a third of the novel and then two other novellas that he'd written. So it's not a bad book at all. In some ways, I almost prefer some of the translation in the first thing, but it was only a third of the novel, unfortunately. And I thought that, they were just trying to give a general introduction, I think, to Wang Xiaobo. And I think the new thing is it is a systematic, it's a full translation of the novel, and one hopes that others will follow.
So who's the translator of the full novel? And also, I love that I get to ask you this because you often don't when you're interviewing someone who reviewed a book in translation, but how does it compare to the original?
The current translation is done by a person who lives in the greater New York area called Yan Yan. I don't know the person personally, but it's a good translation. I've read the bits and pieces of the novel. I've picked it up, and I think he captures it. I mean, the language is very humorous, and that comes through in the novel. He's always making ridiculous asides, and I think that comes through quite well in the translation.
From the description in your review, one might assume that this is a somewhat epic book, but it's actually not that long. It comes in at under 300 pages. What is the pace experience of reading it? Is this a pretty, like you said, it's humorous? Is it a quick comic read?
It is a pretty quick read. There are 3 sections to it. There's the first section called Golden Age, or the Golden Age, and that's the part that was translated previously, and that's the part that more explores the time in Yunnan in the south when he's a teenager. Then there's a second section called At 30, a Man, which is a translation of an idiomatic expression in Chinese that means that when you're 30 years old, then you've become an adult, essentially. That's when you really grow up, when you're 30 years old. And that takes place when he's working in various factories, which also parallels Wang Xiaobo's experiences. And he's trying to find his footing in life. He's trying to figure out what am I doing and what did I experience and what am I supposed to do with myself after these strange experiences, this half-baked education that I've received. And then the third part is called Years as Water Flow. And he's talking about an image that he takes from Proust in Search of Lost Time, where it's like you're under the water, watching the water rushing past you. And the years seem to be racing by, and you can't sort of keep track of that. And that's when it's in that section when he has this epiphany about what it takes to be a good person and to try to deal with the past. And I think the novel, yeah, it reads pretty quick. I mean, you can read it in a couple of days. It really isn't that hard.
You are the author of several books, as I said up top, most recently Forbidden City, the Palace at the Heart of Chinese Culture. I'm wondering what you're working on now, what might be coming next from you.
I'm working now on a book called Sparks, which is about underground histories of China. I'm looking at Chinese people who are active in Xi Jinping's China today, who are challenging the Communist Party's monopoly over history. So these are people who are writing underground novels, history books, Samizdat publications, underground documentary films, and who are still, despite this being maybe the tightest period of China since the Cultural Revolution, who are still finding a way to challenge the party. And I've spent a lot of time with these people on the ground in China, and I'm putting it together into a book that sort of looks back over efforts that go back to really the beginning of the People's Republic's history to challenge the party. And it includes Wang Xiaobo because he's such a influential character for so many of these people, the way he confronted silence and why he decided that he had to speak out. And so this is also part of my book.
Well, I'm glad we could connect the two. We will definitely look forward to what comes next from you. And in the meantime, very much appreciate you coming by to talk about The Golden Age by Wang Xiaobo, recently translated and available now. Thanks so much, Ian.
My pleasure.
My colleagues Dave Kim and Elizabeth Egan join me now to talk about what we've all been reading. Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Dave, why don't we start with you? What's on your plate these days?
I'm reading Time Shelter by the Bulgarian writer Georgi Gospodinov, and it's translated by Angela Rodell. This is a book about nostalgia and going to really extreme lengths to relive the past. It starts with a therapist named Gostin starting a clinic for Alzheimer's patients that recreates rooms from different decades down to the smallest of details, the furniture, the music, the cigarettes. He makes these period rooms that transport patients to whichever decade they feel most comfortable in. And this kind of thing actually does exist in the real world, I found, and the treatment is often called reminiscence therapy. It's supposed to help stimulate memories and help with depression, etc. Except in this novel, the clinic starts to become very popular, and suddenly all kinds of people with or without dementia start visiting. And it's a place where people just deal with their trauma or escape from their general dreariness, or just think about happier times. And some more clinics start opening, larger facilities. And this is one of those books where a kind of out there concept just gets taken to its plausible extremes, like a lot of speculative fiction or a Stephen Millhauser story. So people start creating like whole districts and neighborhoods that are set in the past, and whole cities with radio stations playing music from a certain era and reenactments happening. A sort of like nostalgia fever starts taking over Europe. And this is the halfway point where the novel switches from being about personal trauma and psychology to something much more political, because then countries start holding referendums trying to decide which decade they want to go back to. Like Bulgaria wants to go back to 60s style communism. France chooses the early 80s. Most of the Eastern Bloc chooses 1989 specifically. And these are seen by citizens as those nations' glory days, and whatever problems existed during that time have faded in memory. And so the book starts to turn into just a really interesting look at how nostalgia and political ideology are intertwined. It's, of course, not hard to think of Make America Great Again or Brexit, for example, but I think Gospodinov is looking at this on a much more global scale, and he just does it with a good amount of humor and satire, too.
What caused you to pick it up?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I mean, a lot of political things are happening, but I actually was more interested in just the basic premise of this reminiscence therapy. And I think the political stuff actually came as a surprise. The book has this scene in the middle where you really see it shift from being about like personal trauma and psychology to this more political thing. And I found that fascinating. I guess I was just first interested in the type of therapy that we were doing in the beginning.
It's high concept.
It's very high concept, and it gets taken to, like I said, it just gets taken to an extreme that I didn't see coming.
Liz, what about you? High concept, low concept?
I would say medium concept. And my book is incredibly uplifting, but it is certainly incredibly entertaining. It's called The Displacements, and it's by Bruce Holsinger. It came out on July 5th. It's a climate disaster novel about a Category 6 hurricane, the first ever. Its name is Luna, to hit Miami. It wipes out Miami and parts of Texas. And this story follows the Larson Hall family, which consists of a mother named Daphne, who is an artist, her two young kids, and her stepson, whose name is Gavin, as they evacuate, only to realize pretty late in the game and when their gas tank is on empty that Gavin has left Daphne's purse in the driveway of their massive and way too close to the water mansion in Florida. So they have no credit cards and they have very limited phone access. And the scene where they realize this as they're waiting in a really long line for gas among tons of other people who are evacuating kind of reminded me of that moment in a horror movie when the babysitter realizes that the call is coming from inside the house. You know, it's not going to be good. And the family ends up at a place called Thule Farm, which is a mega shelter where they meet with other desperate people, including a government aid worker who's kind of overseeing the whole establishment. So you have alternating perspectives throughout the book, and you also have screenshots from something called The Great Displacement, a digital chronicle of the Luna migration. And that includes transcripts and maps and charts from this period in American history. You're sort of looking back on it when there's been this huge disaster. So it is incredibly fast paced and incredibly scary in parts, especially given some of the things that we're seeing in terms of the climate this summer with recent heat waves. But I truly could not put it down. I had to read it really quickly because my husband was so eager to pick it up next. And when I realized I was going to be on the podcast, I tried to find the copy that we shared, which has already disappeared from my house. I think he gave it to somebody else. It's just one of those books that you'll pass along and recommend. Perfect for this time of year.
I feel like you should have lied to your husband and told him it was slowing down and, oh, don't worry, the second half isn't as good. You know, I'll give it to you when I'm done. Yeah.
I have a reputation as a fast reader. So he was like really pressuring me. How many more pages do you have? But it didn't affect my enjoyment of the book. John, what are you reading?
I'm going to talk about something I really just started only because, you know, I've been kind of juggling some things that aren't, I think, as interesting as this. It's weird to say, but I'm going to be reading The Wizard of Oz. And the reason is, it's a delayed reason. A year or so ago, at least probably, I follow someone on Twitter who goes by Caustic Cover Critic. He's an Australian writer, I believe, who started a blog that had a lot to do with cover design and things like that. He tweets about all kinds of literary things. And he had this grid of covers that he had posted of the original Wizard of Oz books in the series. And of course, what surprised me about it was both the number of them. There were a lot, not just The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the first book, but he shared some plot points from them. And all I can say is that the book called The Tin Woodman of Oz, which I think is the 12th in the series, there were 14 or 15, is basically tells the backstory of the Tin Man. And it is disturbing. If you go to the Wikipedia plot summary, it's very dark. and complicated, but not what you, even though the original, the movie scared me as a kid. I loved it and it scared me, which was rare. Usually things that scared me, I ran away from and got 100 miles away from. But I've always absolutely loved the movie. And this just made me really curious about the source material in a way that I hadn't quite been before. And so I have this really big, beautiful book called The Annotated Wizard of Oz, obviously by L. Frank Baum, edited with an introduction and annotations by Michael Patrick Hearn. And it's just full of these gorgeous illustrations and posters and photos, art from the books over the years. And so I'm only about halfway into the very long introduction. I think it's 80 or 90 pages long, though it includes a lot of photos and things. And I'm looking forward to it. I'm wondering if it will just be a one-off, interesting, very unlike me reading experience, or whether it will lead me to read some of the following books, because they really do sound deeply strange in a way that, again, the movie, even though it's creepy in parts, has a kind of traditional, maybe just because it's such a classic, we come to think of it as a traditional feel to it. I don't know how you two feel about the movie.
Oh, I love the movie, but I haven't read the book. I'm eager to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, what are the annotations saying in the book? Like, they just give historical context?
Yeah, I think some of them are biographical about Baum. Some of them are historical, like, even from the early days, I think that there were musical reviews based on the book. There was a
Pink Floyd lyrics.
Yeah, here's one I just happened to flip to randomly. It says, opening night of the 1902 musical extravaganza in Chicago. The role of the wizard did not go over when John Slavin played him straight on that night, so he turned him into a Dutch comedian. His successor, Bobby Gaylord, made Oz a wisecracking Irishman. There was a dreadful 1925 silent picture. W.C. Fields turned down the chance to portray the wizard in the 1939 movie. So all kinds of, but I mean, there's the hundreds and hundreds of notes like that. So it's very rich. And I think it's almost more like a history book / reading the original book at the same time. So it's a dual experience, I think. And I will definitely keep you both posted about how it goes. I'd be curious to know if listeners have any experience with the book. I know everyone has seen the movie. I know that there's another movie that was made, I don't want to get this wrong, it could have been as recently as like the 80s or 90s, that was, I think, based on one of here it is. It's called Return to Oz, and it was made in 1985. I have not seen it, but apparently it is much more in keeping with the unhinged insanity of the books. And in that respect has both a small group of cultic admirers, but a lot of people who don't get it and think it's a bridge too far. So the very least thing I can recommend is going on down a rabbit hole online, because there's a lot to learn about all this stuff and it's all pretty interesting.
That can be our reminiscence therapy.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Just to bring it all
much
back to Dave.
Yeah, back to my childhood fear. So tell us again what you guys have been reading.
I'm reading Time Shelter by Yorgi Gospodinov, translated by Angela Rodell.
I just finished The Displacements by Bruce Holsinger.
And I'm making my way into The Annotated Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum, edited with an introduction and notes by Michael Patrick Hearn. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm John Williams.